Well, we are, Revelation chapter 21. We are looking at what's called the eternal state in Revelation 21 and 22. I've divided this chapter into just two sections, verses 1 through 8. It's talking about the New Jerusalem's arrival. So we could call that New Jerusalem arrived. And in verses 9 through the end of the chapter 27, we can call that the New Jerusalem described in those verses there. Point out a few things as we go through this. In verses 1 through 4, we see a section here talking about the new creation. Some discussion, again, among dispensationalists as to whether or not this is a renovation of the existing earth or a brand new heaven and earth. And I take the view that it's a brand new heaven and earth, mostly based on verse 1 here. He saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. So what does this mean? So it means, I think, that the existing heaven and earth, the ones that we experience right now, are going to be totally replaced in the eternal state. Also point out that the first heaven and first earth had passed away. There is no room for a second heaven and second earth. So I know some people, again, among dispensationalists, believe in a gap theory, that there's a gap between Genesis 1 and 2, where there was a earlier fall and a renovation of the earth, but this doesn't seem to leave room for that. There's a first heaven and earth that's replaced by the new heaven and earth. No room for another one, or no room for a gap there. Also point out that the sea was no more. What does that mean? So throughout the book of Revelation, we see the sea as symbolic of Gentile nations opposed to the Lord. Throughout the New Testament, the sea is a place of mystery, place of demonic spirits. So I think this is communicating that these opposition is gone. Spiritual and physical opposition to the Lord is gone. And he say, coming down from heaven, prepared as a bride, endured for her husband, heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. So this is the Lord physically among his people, ruling directly. This hasn't happened since 1 Samuel, I guess, when Saul was put on a throne and a mediatorial ruler was put in place. That this is God's taking his place, and it's the highest blessing for the survivors there. It's highest blessing for those going into the eternal state, that he is going to dwell. They will be his people. God himself will be with them as their God. I think this is a fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant, specifically Genesis 12, verse 3, where it says that all the nations of the earth will be blessed through the Abrahamic offspring. I think this is the fulfillment of that. Verse 4 says, death will be no more. So therefore there will be no mourning or crying or pain, for the former things have passed away. I think this is a reversal of the Edenic curse, bringing death for sin. So that's been reversed here. And then in verse 8 of this section, we see, as for the cowardly, the faithless, the detestable, as for the murderers, the sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which will be the second death. So they are confined to this lake of fire. In Revelation chapter 20, verse 10, we see the satanic trinity there suffering, and it says they will suffer eternally in that fire. So I take this to be an affirmation that this is the eternal flames of hell, that they will not be annihilated. They'll not simply cease to exist at some point, but they'll be in those eternal flames forever. Verses 9 through 27 then describe the New Jerusalem in some detail. Again, I'll point out some things to you here. Verses 12 through 14, notice that it's talking about the gates. On the gates are inscribed the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. And then in verse 14, we have the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. So it looks like even in the eternal state, we have a separation between Israel and the church, which continues. Israel represented by the 12 tribes of inscribed on the gates, and then the church by the 12 apostles of the Lamb. So it looks like the separation between Israel and the church continues. Verses 15 through 17, we see the dimensions of the New Jerusalem that's coming down from heaven. It's enormous. It's massive. It's hard to imagine how big this is if we take this literally. According to my calculations, we're talking about 1,400 square miles on a side. That is going to be from basically the Rocky Mountains where I live to the Appalachians, so it covers the Midwest of the United States. It's got 1.9 million square miles, according to my calculation, 3.4 billion cubic miles. If we take this as a 1,400 mile cube, then this is going to be 600 stories tall. Not only 1,400 miles on each side, but 600 stories tall. So this is massive. Some have looked at this and dismissed it as a literal interpretation. So they've interpreted it as just symbolic of the perfect dwelling place for God, the symmetry, the similarity to the Holy of Holies, I think. Also, the fulfillment of all God's promises is how it's been interpreted as well. And again, by now you probably know I stick with the literal interpretation. I'll stand corrected when the time comes if this is a spiritually viewed thing. But again, my sense is that and my experience is when you see this kind of precision of description and size, it's suggesting that it's literal. So I take this as literal dimensions of the city. We see also that there's no temple there, and that there's God's glory is illuminating everything. So I take this to mean that there's no longer restricted access to God. You know, the temple had a whole series of restrictions on how that you had to pass through in order to get to the Holy of Holies, and that only once a year. What we see here, I think, is that there's unrestricted access to God in the New Jerusalem, and that he is present continuously among his people. Also point out in verse 24 that there's still nations on the surface of the earth, on the new heavens and the new earth now. I think that's very interesting. If you go back and look at one of my earlier YouTube videos, I do have a YouTube video on the Bible and borders. I think it was a Saturday special in that playlist. But in the Bible and borders, I go through essentially abbreviated biblical theology of borders, and they exist from the Garden of Eden right through here to the eternal state. So there seems like there's going to be nations. Nations will be worshiping the Lord at this point, bringing their treasures into the New Jerusalem and honoring him there. So if you want to know more about that, I'd encourage you to go take a look at that Bible and Borders video where I explain that and walk through it. So this is the initial description of the eternal state. Tomorrow we'll be in Revelation chapter 22, and we'll finish up our journey from Romans to Revelation. So good for you for sticking with this. What I'll be doing after we finish this, I'll be taking a break. I'll be putting out some videos less frequently than once a day, but I'll continue to do produce some content between now and the end of the year, probably a couple times a week. And then starting in January, we'll pick up again on another series, a daily series. So God bless you, and may the Lord bless the reading of his word and motivate you to holy, expectant living as we look for the glorious appearing of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ.